Good afternoon and welcome to the Amherst Women's Club. This is our first chance at doing a Zoom meeting with all of you. We've had good response from the membership, so I want to thank all of you who have tuned in, and you'll have a chance at the end of John's talk to ask questions if you want to. And now I'll turn it over to Catherine Lombardi, who will introduce our speaker for this afternoon, John Lombardi.
Okay, everybody, did that work?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm happy to introduce John as our first virtual speaker of this year's meetings. John comes from a multi-generational family of educators. He says that he went to school as a child and just never got out. He has taught in the university every year for 57 years. He has been a university administrator for 50 of those years, and he was president or chancellor of a university for 22 of those years. For fun, he likes to repair old vehicles. He likes to get them running smoothly and to fiddle with the engines until they purr, just like he did when he fixed problems in the institutions of higher education. John will speak on universities after the crisis. Okay, now it's John's turn.
Hi. Well, I'm delighted to be here in the Amherst Women's Club. Usually I come and just listen to people talk, and that's really a big plus. But now they're going to make me work, which seems appropriate, I think. Today, what we wanted to talk a little bit about is what we expect to happen in the next, say, 5 to 10 years after this crisis is over. Because one of the great challenges of being in the middle of a crisis is it's hard to estimate what it means for our institutions, particularly colleges and universities. And the temptation is, when in the middle of the crisis, to imagine that dramatic changes will take place as a consequence of the crisis. But the truth is that in general, these kinds of events, while they're traumatic in the passage of them, in the end, the institutions recover remarkably well. And when they go on into the future, they look very much like they were before. Now, that doesn't mean that things don't change, but we need to have a sense of the scale of the operation of American higher education in order to have some sense of the likely impact that we're going to see. The first thing to remember is that American higher education is huge. It involves some 20 million people engaged in learning and taking courses and pursuing degrees and certificates, 20 million people. So it's a big operation. Moreover, there's about 4,000 institutions of various sizes, shapes, and kinds, and character that participate in this process. So it's very hard to make generalizations that apply to every single one of these institutions. So really, the best way to look at this is sort of shrink the field a little so we know what we're talking about. So really, what we really want to talk about are the four-year institutions and the research universities that constitute the core of American higher education and set the standards and the traditions that affect everybody who's involved in higher education. Now, of those 4,000 institutions, there's really only about 1,500 or a little more than 1,500 that are engaged in full-time, four-year traditional college and university activities. Those are the public and private universities we know real well. They're like Amherst College, they're like Smith College, they're like the University of Massachusetts, they're like the University of Florida, they're like Michigan and UCLA and Wisconsin. Those are the big guys that operate in higher education and set the standards that most everybody else in one form or another follows. These institutions vary dramatically in their size. So we imagine that the private universities and the public universities are pretty much in the same universe. But they're not exactly in the same universe because most of the private institutions are very small. So there's lots of private institutions, many more private institutions than there are public institutions. But the public institutions teach almost all the students. They teach some 75% of all the students are in public universities. And that's because many of these private universities are very small. They're under 2,500 students, whereas the public universities range from 10,000 up to 30 and 40,000 students. So the result is that when we talk about colleges and universities, we have to be clear whether we're talking about the little ones or the big ones, whether we're talking about the ones that affect a small number of students or a large number of students. Now, in addition to that, the universities vary dramatically in what they do. So when we have universities that are at the top of the scale that everybody focuses on, the Amherst and the Harvards and the Stanfords and the UCLAs and the Michigans, these are the top institutions in America. They're institutions with great resources, great capacity, do an enormous amount of research, and reach across the world in their impact. And then we have very small universities, very small public universities in some regional area in the Midwest who have maybe 2,000 or 3,000 students. They have a 4-year program, but they don't do a lot of research. They're not involved in that part of the activity. So it's important also to separate out the different categories of institutions to recognize the impact. Now, the first thing that we all know is that institutions that are very small and very poor are always susceptible to whatever shock is going to hit us. So whether it was the financial downturn in 2008, or whether it's our current crisis associated with the pandemic, we know those institutions are going to suffer the most because they're the ones that are right on the edge of economic survival. They're the ones who, if they lose 15 or 20 students, they're in terrible fiscal difficulty. Now, if you're at Ohio State University and you lose 15 or 20 students, you don't know that anything happened at all. But if you're some of these very small institutions, that kind of a loss of a small number of students will cause a catastrophe. The second thing you have to pay attention to is how much money they have. Now, we don't always like to talk about money exactly, but money is the main driver of institutional success. If you have a lot of money, you can do a whole lot better than if you don't have a lot of money. Now, this is not rocket science. This is not simple mind. This is simple-minded stuff. And so we know that institutions that have a lot of money are able to survive difficult times much better than institutions that have very little money. They don't have any endowment. They don't have a lot of gifts. They live on the tuition they receive from their students. So if they don't have the students, they don't have enough money to pay their bills. And so over the next, 3 to 5 years, we will lose some number of small private colleges, right? We lose now about 15 a year, right? About 15 a year close. Every year, small private colleges, they close. Public universities and public colleges, no matter how small, they never close because they all have a political base that sustains them even when times are tough. But small private colleges that have student bodies under 1,000 and have no money are in very great danger of being in bankruptcy at the end of this process. So if we're looking at a place that's really going to be damaged, it's those little tiny institutions. So we, instead of losing 15 a year, they will lose maybe 20. And it'll be a tragedy for the institutions and their students and their alumni, but it won't have any impact on the larger scale of American higher education because they educate such a small number of students, right? And they have such a small part of the whole 20 million person participants in higher education. Now, the second thing that will happen is that after this pandemic is over and we have all readjusted, we will find that almost all colleges and universities will revert to primarily what they were doing before. So they're not all going to go back home immediately, be online, and have no more student activities and no more stuff. No, they're going to return to pretty much what they looked like before. There will be some changes. As always, whenever there is a crisis, when we come back, things aren't exactly the same, but they'll be very, very close to what we've seen before. Now, one of the things that's happened in many of these institutions is that during the crisis, which is the case in almost every crisis in American higher education, right, the institutions shrink some parts of their activity because they don't have as much money as they used to have. So whether in 2008 crisis or the current crisis, the institutions are having very serious financial difficulties. And so as a result, they shrink programs, they eliminate faculty, they put people on furloughs, they lay off individuals, and they sort of mothball many parts of their programs. Now, there's a differential impact that takes place here. On one side, it's tremendously damaging to the individuals who are impacted by those occasions. So if you're laid off, you're laid off. You're not making any money. So it's a tremendous impact on you individually. But for the institution, when it comes back, it will rehire people in various places, and the institution itself will still continue pretty much as it did before. So it's always important to separate the immediate impacts on individuals who are hurt when something like this happens, and the long-term impact on the institutional operation, which changes very little over the long period of time. And some of us are very old. None of you in the audience, of course, you're all young, but people like me who are very old, we remember that period from 1960, 61, all the way through 1978. In that whole period, tremendous turmoil, change, and argument, and the fight over the war in Vietnam, and the civil rights movement, and all kinds of other transformations took place in our society. And the universities were in turmoil over that time. We had the National Guard on campuses. We had a very, very dramatic period in our academic life. And yet today, it's hard to find any dramatic fundamental differences in the way the universities are organized. So universities that were at the top level of performance back in 1964, 65, 68, 70, 71, they're still at the top of the stack. They're still the best universities in America. They still have the largest number of students. They still have the most budget. They're still doing the most work that's associated with higher education. That means, of course, that while the transformation of society that changes take place during those periods were important and fundamentally changed how we see the world, their impact on the structure of these universities and their ability to lead higher education has changed not as much as we might like think, we might like to imagine, and many of us might like to hope. Because universities have a characteristic that I always try to remind everybody. They're always there, right? I tell people that if you transported me back to Salamanca in 1525 at the University of Salamanca, and I got my Spanish readjusted so I could understand what was going on, I would be able to operate without too much change in the way they operated their academic programs, the way they did promotion and tenure and hiring and teaching and all of that good stuff would be carried on in ways that we would find very, very familiar. And that's because these institutions are so profoundly important to their societies that they're exceedingly stable. They're very, very stable. We don't lose very many institutions. Now, one of the things that's going to happen as a result of the pandemic is that systems and processes that were coming along before the pandemic will continue after the pandemic, but possibly accelerated in the speed with which the changes that were taking place will continue to take place. So, for example, we now have some shifts taking place in the structure of the faculty, right? Fewer and fewer faculty now are full-time tenured faculty members, although still they represent about half, a little more than half of the instructional staff. Still, the number of non-tenured track, non-permanent, non-full-time faculty teaching in America's colleges and universities, especially those below the top level, that number of full-time people has declined significantly over the last 15, 20 years. So that will continue as we go forward after the pandemic, primarily because many institutions suffered financial troubles, and so when they come back, they won't hire as many full-time faculty because they think they don't need them. A second thing that we're going to probably find is we're going to find an increased emphasis in many institutions on a continued growth of professional programs. That is, programs that are designed to train people for specific types of jobs rather than the traditional liberal arts education, which was designed to train people to be well-rounded citizens. And so that process will also continue to accelerate as we move out of this pandemic impact. And finally, one of the most important transformations that's been going on for some time is the separation of institutions into categories, clusters, right, that are significantly different. So for example, we have some universities that we call major research universities. They are phenomenally powerful. They have very large budgets. They have highly qualified faculty. They do an enormous amount of research, right? And they attract the highest prestige professors. They attract the most qualified students. They capture the highest level of quality that we're able to get in higher education. Those institutions, that group of institutions is remarkably stable and remarkably effective at maintaining their high level of support. So if we look over the last 20 years, we find that the group of top American research universities, some 125, 130 institutions, these institutions are the same institutions today as they were 20 years ago. Very few dropped out of that top category. Very few entered that top category. That tells you that the system of higher education at the top level is very stable, and very powerful, and very well supported by all kinds of agencies and the government and private fundraising and foundations and all kinds of other assets that generate a high level of support that is much greater than the other institutions are able to mobilize. There'll be a second tier that's made up of good universities that have some research, they have good professors, but they don't compete at the top level of higher education, right? They compete at a middle level where they get good students, and they take those students and they give them a good education, and they send them out in the world to do good works. But they're not at the peak level of this competitive process of higher education quality. And below that, there's a third level of institutions who are marginal in many ways, struggling to find their mission, struggling to find ways to maintain their student numbers, struggling to capture enough resources to sustain the quality of their programs. And so this difference in these three tiers, and we could subdivide them more if we wanted to, but generally in these three tiers, right, we see a different set of behaviors and opportunities and strengths and weaknesses and revenue possibilities that are available to all these institutions. Now, in this conversation, we can talk a lot about what we would like to have higher education look like. Right? We would like it to be certain ways. We would like it to do certain things. We would prefer that it did other things. But higher education is a highly competitive business. The people in higher education compete constantly to try to get the best professors, try to get the best students, try to get the most money, to have the most elegant programs, the most elaborate campuses, the most elaborate student services, the greatest amount of support for students, and indeed the biggest athletic programs. All of those things are highly competitive parts of the enterprise that's higher education. And so in this competition, we end up, of course, with universities that are very successful in the competition, universities that are modestly successful in the competition, and universities that are struggling in the competition. And that characteristic has been there, for the last 30 or 40 years, and it continues, but it gets even more and more intense because everybody is concerned about acquiring the characteristics that will allow them as students when they graduate to get good jobs and to have a good lifestyle and to be able to earn significant amounts of money. And so the result is that everybody is competing to try to have the best ability to capture the most desirable students under the most desirable conditions and then provide them the most elaborate higher education possible. Indeed, if we look at where the growth is in the personnel of higher education, we find that the faculty numbers stay almost flat. The faculty numbers stay almost flat. Right? But all of the numbers associated with student services have continued to grow at rates of 5 to 6% a year, right? Because the student services function is become one of the most important quality determinants for capturing quality students. Right? Students anticipate, and their parents anticipate, that when they come to the university, they will enter a context that is incredibly supportive, that is incredibly student-centered, and therefore will provide students with endless variety of activities and facilities and entertainment and support and health and welfare and other kinds of services. And so we have hired more and more people who are expert in providing that kind of support. And so the universities are competing not only on the quality of their research and the quality of their academic programs, but they're also competing on the quality of the context in which the students enter and participate in academic life. And that, of course, is part of the reason why we are all so sort of shell-shocked by the pandemic, which extracted the students from that context. But it just eliminated, in many institutions, most institutions, it eliminated the context and only provided the content, and then in a form like you're getting it today, right? Online, in some kind of non-personal interaction that is very hard to sustain. And so this has produced a tremendous sort of anxiety among students and their parents and institutions as they have recognized the separation between the content, which is the stuff you learn, right? Reading, writing, and arithmetic, and various other kinds of skills and programs and so forth. And over here, the context within which you learn these things. And so it's the context that the pandemic just cut short. It just stopped the context. And so that's why we feel so disoriented by what has happened, because we have always thought of the content and the context together as a combined product that we provided to students that would create for them the skills and the abilities and the talents and the expertise, so that when they graduate or go on to professional schools, they will be able to succeed. And so when we extract that content, that context, and say, no more context, no more residence halls, no more activities, no more congregating, no more learning about new friends, none of that stuff, that's all gone, right? All that's left is the content, the reading, the writing, the arithmetic, and we can do that online, right? The quality of which you can get online is first rate, but because it doesn't have that surrounding context, we feel sort of cast adrift in this process of higher education, and we probably feel that it is more damaging structurally to the institution than in fact long-term it will be. Because as soon as the pandemic fades out, within a year or a year and a half or whatever it will take, right, the context will be recreated, right? That context will be reinvented around the content that stayed the same and continued throughout this period. And once that takes place, of course, we will then look very much like we did before, although perhaps we won't be quite so confident that we understand the processes that we're engaged in. And so when we look at that, it's very helpful to try and not imagine that the end of the world is here. And I get a lot of conversation with people who tell me, oh, the end of the university is here, we're going to be a mess, nothing's going to, it's going to be bad when it's over. I have to tell you, I'm willing, well, I can't make book, but if I could make book, I'd be willing to bet that 5 years from now, we will look like 90% like we did before the pandemic hit us, in the way in which the university operates, in the way in which students think about the university, the way in which they engage, and things that were in process before the pandemic hit will have to pick up and be in process after the pandemic leaves, and perhaps accelerated some, but not in a catastrophic or institution-breaking way. Now, just sort of bring this to a little bit of a conclusion so you can ask me a lot of questions. But I want to emphasize an important element of this conversation about higher education. It's unbelievably important, right, to try not and make too many grand generalizations about higher education, because it is so different in the different categories of institutions. What is a big problem for the university, for Stanford University, is a much different problem for a small liberal arts college in rural. They don't live in the same world. They have the same kinds of educational activities, but the worlds they live in are dramatically different, and they operate dramatically different. So when we have a conversation about what's going to happen in the future, we need to say, well, I'm talking about the big research universities. I'm talking about the major comprehensive universities that educate so many students, and mostly public. I'm talking about small private universities and colleges who have a whole different set of categories. So let me close here and open the conversation up to any kinds of questions or suggestions or comments or wisdom that you all can provide us. Thank you. I don't know how this works. Somebody's going to moderate this conversation. We're all going to be on. I guess you wave your hand or something.
Got it.
We'll call on you.
Okay,
This is,
Henri.
I'm sorry, but they've been mowing the lawn and power washing our condo all the time you were speaking, so I must have missed a lot. But what I wanted to ask you about was the investments in the university. During this time, how your folks that are out there seeking investment for research and so on, has that fallen off to a tremendous amount?
No, it hasn't fallen off a tremendous amount. It's fallen off some, but the truth is that research, because it is continuous, right? People have research grants and they're for 1 year, 2 year, 3 year. And so the work mostly has gone on, although some of it has slowed down. Research that requires interaction with individuals, like social science research, some of that has had to be postponed because people can't go around doing the same kind of survey research and the same kind of interactions. But the scientific research process has been continuing pretty much on the same pace, although a little bit slower, because the grants and the process is very long. It takes, between the time you have a good idea and the time somebody funds it and the time you do the work, you're looking at 3-4 years. So being in the middle of this, the inertia of that process just keeps rolling through. And the federal government is still funding research at the same levels pretty much as it has in the past. The foundations are now investing a little more in activities that are more oriented to recovery from the pandemic or supporting people who are disproportionately affected by the pandemic, right? But even so, those programs also tend to be long-term. So if somebody's interested in the problem of climate change and they've had a research grant, that grant, even from a foundation, is going to continue over this period because the problem of climate change is going to continue beyond this period.
Thank you.
Okay, Donna, go ahead.
You're muted, Donna.
You're muted.
Get on you. Okay, hi. I have a question when we think about the interest in the world, because I mean, one of the great trends before the pandemic was an interest in globalization. And if you're particularly looking at, I would say even the struggling institutions, you were able to convince those students that they should be interested in global identities and such. And I'm just wondering, and I know my own sense is that there's been a certain stepping back from that. And I wondered what the others may think about that.
Well, I think there is always a challenge in maintaining an interest in international issues and worldwide issues. American universities have traditionally been very focused on their own world, which is part of the way America has traditionally functioned. And one of the ways we engage internationally, as you know, with international students, right? International students coming to the United States, although most of them are graduate students, some significant number were undergraduates, and that nourished an international perspective on the part of both the institutions and the American students studying there. Same thing true with study abroad, which took kids overseas and put them in environments where they would have to engage a local culture. The interest in that continues, but I think you're right, it's probably less intense in many ways because the focus of many students has turned inward to problems within the United States itself. And so there's tremendous concerns with issues of equity and issues of participation in society and so forth that have captured the student population in a way that is more domestically focused than internationally focused. And also, we've been through a period now in the United States where we have perhaps lost our position as the premier participant in world affairs, partly because of the rise of China, partly because of the rise of all of the nations of South Asia and Southeast Asia. All of those have tended to diminish the American the American engagement in this notion of being responsible for the world. So I think you're right. We probably don't have as much engagement in our institutions worldwide, but I think what's really happened is a change in the sense of our responsibility. Okay, we previously, in a sort of a dominant way, thought the U.S. was responsible for solving all of these world problems. And I think what we have discovered is that there are many other nations, groups of nations today, who have the capacity to engage these problems directly themselves and take ownership of the solution. So at one time, when we were doing the Green Revolution way back, in the 50s and the early 60s, we would go to places and try and teach them how to invent land-grant universities like we have in the United States as the solution to their economic problems. But today, what's happened since then is that those institutions, those countries have acquired the capacity to work for themselves. And so now they no longer want to have our institutions duplicated, they want to build their own. And so when you look at China, which is of course the most obvious example, they have now a significant number of institutions, higher education institutions, that are capable of competing at the highest international level, competing with all the Western European universities and the US universities that previously completely dominated the research agenda. Now we have Chinese universities who are producing scholars with the capacity to contribute at the highest level of participation. Same thing's true in Japan, the same thing's true in Australia, same thing's true in Malaysia. Wherever you go, you can find first-class universities now that are capable of competing with the best that the US can produce. We may still have the preeminence of producing the most, but they are now all producing quality at the same level we do. And that has also changed our sense of engagement and ownership of the international agenda.
Hey, Tom Lardner, please go ahead.
Hi, it's AJ. I have a question for these thinking about the Chinese universities. I was going to ask something about that. But when you think of how student services are the most important thing of where we send our students, people make decisions of where they're going to send their child. But that is not something that I think is so in the Chinese universities. Am I right or am I wrong?
Yes, in a way. Most other, many, well, I don't know the most, that's probably not fair. A large number of international university systems have a selection process that determines where the student is likely to be able to go early in their career. So they do a lot of testing of children who are young. And as they test them as they're young, they send them in different directions so that by the time they're graduating from high school, they're already tracked to a certain kind of institution in a certain way. And in part that's because the government is paying for that education and for that student's education. We have a different approach. We say that we have all of these institutions open to any student who qualifies or can gain admission. And we try not to tell students what the limit is on their ability to choose an institution. So this generates the tremendous amount of churning and anxiety that surrounds our college selection and admission process. But nonetheless, we think it provides more access and more opportunity and a better chance for people to improve themselves by leaving it open to individuals and their families to make a choice about where they want to try to send their student for higher education. And there are some who make the case that this is inefficient. It would be much more efficient if we tested everybody, test them when they're 6, test them when they're 10, test them when they're 14, and each test track them into different ways to go to different kinds of universities. This has not been part of our tradition ever, and so we're not likely to do that. United States has probably the most complicated institutional arrangements and structures of any place I know about. When I've had international students come and take advanced course in higher education administration about the U.S. They just have a heck of a time understanding that we have no central direction for higher education in America, right? There is no national university in America. There is no organization that sets the standards for everything in higher education. Now, the Department of Education tries to do it, and there's some laws that try to do it, but in the end, in public education, each state, right, runs its own public higher education system with its own goals, its own ideas, its own purposes. And even then, a state may well have 2 or 3 different systems of public higher education that are not controlled centrally. So it'll have a university system, it'll have a state college system, and it'll have a community college system, each of which is run more or less independently and only with marginal connection to the federal government. Okay, so, and then on top of that, we have this dramatic number of private institutions. And on top of that, we made this big experiment with for-profit higher education, which didn't turn out so well, but they're still working on that. What else we got?
Okay. Barker, please go ahead.
Hi, John. It's Elaine Barker. I have to ask the athletic question. I was very sad when
Sure.
everything got closed down. And how are we going to come out of the pandemic with this problem with athletics?
Well, of course, as you may have noticed, the athletic thing is cranking back up. Okay, so most of the institutions that at least played high-level football have brought football back, and they brought it back primarily by creating these bubbles within which they try to contain any virus consequences and do endless testing and that kind of thing. And so that's clearly coming back. I think that once we've passed through the crisis, a year from now or so, we'll be back in a normal, more or less normal athletic process. Now, the part of athletics that is looks like Division III, right, like we have in small colleges and stuff, that probably will not change much over the next several years. But at the high end, the big time, the big football schools, we're going to see a lot of dramatic change, because in the big football schools, there's so much money sloshing around in those institutions and surrounding the activity of college football, and especially men's basketball, where all the money is. Right, that we're going to see an increased commercialization of that activity. We'll have students being able to sell their images and licenses for advertising. We'll have all kinds of sort of free trading of superstar student athletes between institutions. There'll be a lot of shuffling going on, and we may even end up in a year or so with a system whereby we end up paying the superstar student athletes significant amounts of money to play college football and college basketball. Now, how that'll work out, we don't know. We old school people aren't real happy about that. But the fact is, there's so much money out there that it's impossible to resist. When you have the coaches making the kind of contracts they do in the big time, and you have athletic directors making the kind of money they do in the big time, it's very hard for people to say, well, why shouldn't we pay the superstars, student athletes that are making the value more money than simply a very, very nice, well-funded college education. So I think we will see ourselves paying student athletes significant amounts of money. There's all kinds of studies out there about how much we'd end up having to pay them if it became commercial. But I don't know exactly how that'll happen. But I think it will happen, and we don't know whether the fan enthusiasm for college sports will be the same if the student athletes are basically paid performers. That's what we don't know. And of course, today, in some ways, they are paid performers because they have a scholarship and support revenue that almost no other student has. So they're clearly a separate class of student, and they're at the top level of, again, football and basketball. They have benefits that almost no other student has. Still, it's not quite the same as allowing colleges to compete to buy student athletes to come and be student athletes. So, you know, a student would, we'd have like the draft, like they do in professional football. That would be kind of an outcome that we might see. And how that works out, we don't know. But there's a tremendous amount of pressure to have that happen because there's so much money involved at that level. Now, the money doesn't filter down to other parts because, as you know, every athletic program except maybe the top 20 loses money. None of them, they don't make any money. They lose big time. All women's programs lose money. All Olympic sports lose money. Right? So the only people that make big money is men's basketball and football. They can make money, but they don't make enough money together to pay for all of the intercollegiate athletic programs that a big time university might have. And so we think there's probably going to be some shuffling of this sports world within the next, I would give it about three to 5 years, that things will look different. We may see the big time football, basketball activity be shifted off to some other kind of organization to leave the regular college sports enterprise in a way that looks more like Division III, right? Which the competition is the competition, but nobody expects to go pro. Nobody expects to have huge television activity, and nobody expects to see superstar celebrity college athletes. Anybody else got a burning question?
Okay.
Mass?
Sorry. Let me take it off for a second. John has moved away, so we don't have to worry. Well, all I want to do is to thank John for a fantastic talk this afternoon. Even though I know the university to a certain extent, he told me a lot more, and I really appreciate that. I'd like to give you, maybe you already have through Catherine, about a dozen of these. I'd like to give you an Amherst Women's Club mug and thanks.
Very nicely. The question part was really good. It went very well. Yes.
Okay. You want to say goodbye? Or just...
Yep.
Oh, okay.
No. She was trying to figure out
Okay.
to say goodbye and just let everybody.
All right, I've been told to officially say goodbye and close the meeting for this week. Now, remember, we're going to have our regular speakers, so watch for the emails that you'll get every Thursday before the following Monday meeting, and be sure to tune in. And I would just want to again say I really appreciate that all of you signed in. Thanks a lot.
Nice job.